All right, in this video, we're going to focus or take a deeper dive into the idea or the concept of the translation approach. So what's a translation approach? A translation approach is the overall strategic posture adopted by the translator, ideally after careful review of a source text and analysis of its key features. So basically, how am I going to approach this text as I reformulate it? Translation approaches typically apply to individual texts or projects. So on one project, the translator may say, I'm going to take a more literal approach. On another project or text, the translator may say, this calls for a freer approach, just as an example. So as I just sort of alluded to, approaches are generally or traditionally in the translation studies literature and in the profession more broadly categorized as being either literal approach or free approach to translation. So what's literal translation? Literal translation is an emphasis on being faithful to the source text and the source language. Source language features are replicated as closely as possible to communicate the message from a source language and a source culture perspective. On the other hand, free translations or freer translations, they emphasize faithfulness to the target language and target text reader expectations. So the target language expressive conventions are preferred to convey the message as naturally as possible. Okay. Now, beyond this traditional distinction between literal and free translation, we could talk about different typologies or classifications of translation approaches, but clearly literal and free is the most influential. It's very valid and very important, even if we are going to map other types of translation approaches over this. All right. When I talk about translation approaches in the classroom, I like to use the toolbox analogy. The toolbox is the approach. The tools in the toolbox are the translation procedures that we actually use to solve problems. So when we're looking at a project, say somebody sends us a project, hey, will you be able to deliver this project in 3 days, 4 days? We're going to look at the project. I call this surveying the project. And if we agree to translate it, we have to think about our translation approach after all of the analyses that we've talked so much about. That involves bringing the right toolbox or the right set of tools to the job. So that's sort of the toolbox analogy. I'll probably refer to it in class quite often. Toolbox is the approach, the individual tools are the procedures. All right, so I mentioned a few seconds ago, right, this sort of dichotomy or distinction, very traditional, between the literal approach as being source language biased and the free approach as being target reader expectation biased, right? So here I just want to illustrate this with two groupings of segments, kind of mini source texts. The first one is the Miranda warning, and hopefully your only familiarity with a Miranda warning is from TV or movies, and you haven't experienced it in person in any language, right? So the text of it says you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Dun dun, you hear the law and order, right? So a literal translation of this is going to mirror as closely as possible. It's going to stay as close as possible to the target language forms, the language actually used in the source text. The source text forms. A freer translation of this might sound more natural, might sound more idiomatic. It's going to be adapted so that it sounds idiomatic and natural to the target language perpetrator in this case. So what I want you to do is just pause the video right here and compare my literal version and my free version to the source text. You can see that both are acceptable probably, right? But one, the freer version, may sound a little bit more idiomatic in Spanish, okay? Whereas the literal version may sound a little bit more stilted, right, or stiff, okay? So pause and take a look, compare the language, the words I use, the language structures I use, right? When you're ready, take a look at the second text, the second brief source text. This is from a Spanish, not a Spanish translation, a Spanish source text, okay, a blog. This is a movie review of a movie called Wild Wild West, starring Will Smith, I believe, starring Will Smith among other people. Terrible movie. My apologies if you like it. But the reviewer in Spanish said the following: pero con muchos chistes vulgares y escatológicos que pocas veces hacen reír al público, mejor nos sentamos a ver una caricatura del Correcaminos, esas causan más gracia. So, very negative view, kind of a long sentence, which oftentimes is characteristic of Spanish expressive style. And again, pause the video and compare the literal and free versions of the translation approaches of this source text in Spanish. You'll notice that the literal version is very literal, very stiff, very stilted. It still makes sense, but it's not really acceptable for a target language audience, for an English-speaking audience. Whereas I chose to do a very free translation to illustrate the free version, right? If it's laughs thereafter, moviegoers would get more giggles from a few Roadrunner episodes than from watching these 2 hours of lame, dirty jokes that almost always miss the mark. So I took some liberties. I don't say things in exactly the same way, but both versions should communicate the same information. In other words, they should both demonstrate cognitive equivalence. All right. So pause on this slide and take a look at the literal and free translations of both source texts. Are you pausing? Are you doing that? All right. We're going to move on to the next slide. Another way of conceptualizing or talking about translation approaches beyond the simplistic, I think, and sort of the traditional kind of crusty old literal free would be to think of translation approaches as the kind of target language usage, types of approaches to target language usage that are going to result in effective translation. So I've come up with these three. A faithful approach would involve unconventional use of the target language. In other words, it might sound strange to target language readers or listeners, but the purpose of doing a faithful, in other words, you're being faithful to the source language author or faithful to the source language, extremely faithful. The purpose would be to replicate the stylistic idiosyncrasies of the source text author. So here, there's a correlation with prioritizing formal equivalence. On the other extreme, so let's skip balanced. On the other extreme, you have a creative. This might be something like an extremely free approach. So you're using the target language creatively, and the purpose is to ensure that the reader perceives a specific effect. So that is targeting or prioritizing dynamic equivalence to the extreme, usually. So faithful approaches and creative approaches are extremes, and in most cases they're not appropriate, although you may dabble here and there during the course of any particular translation. I think most of the types of text that get translated nowadays, the bulk of written material that's translated, we're going to be right here in this middle, kind of a sweet spot in terms of our approaches, and I call this the balanced approach. This would involve natural use, so as opposed to unconventional or creative. Natural use of the target language for these two purposes: to convey the same information in the same register and tone. So what we're really focusing here, what we're really prioritizing are cognitive and dynamic equivalence. Same information in a way that the reader experiences the text the same as a source text reader would have. So I think that these can still be mapped onto, I sort of have this orange side, which is more literal translation or source language bias, and the bluer half, which is the free translation side of the spectrum, where what's important is target text reader, the target text reader expectations, right? And so at the bottom, again, I've mapped these onto there. You have the faithful on one side, one extreme, where really what's important is formal equivalence, the author's characteristic or idiosyncratic style. This correlates to the expressive function, primary function of language. In the middle and the bulk of text, we have using target language naturally, that balanced approach. This targets both cognitive and mostly dynamic equivalence. So what's important is the message, fidelity to the message, but also reader expectations. So we're hitting on both the informative and the vocative functions. And then the other extreme, to the very extreme free translation side of the spectrum, would be the creative approach, where we're using the target language creatively or even artistically. So think maybe of translating a song lyric, right? It really is a creative endeavor. Okay, let's look at some examples and also talk about how genre. Many times I come back to genre because genre conventions tell us so much. It's kind of, if we know a genre, if we're familiar with a genre, it really gives us a shortcut in terms of our analysis and thinking. So perhaps when we're trying to determine which translation approach, literal or free, right, faithful, balanced, or creative, would be most effective, genre has a lot to tell us. So we have 5 examples here. What's the genre? What's the primary language function of the text? How important or relevant is the author in his or her characteristic style? So on the extreme left, we have the Bible. This happens to actually be a King James version of the Bible, right? So the genre is sacred text, scripture. The primary language function is perhaps expressive, but also very much vocative to try to shape or affect behavior. The author status is extremely important because the authors are God himself or a particular prophet, right? And so that's very important. So perhaps we're going to adopt a more literal, right, translation where our bias is toward the source language, the source language culture, the source text expressive conventions, and things like this. But as we know, there are many different translations of the Bible along the spectrum from free to literal, from faithful to creative. The second text is a novel, a very well-known novel. Hopefully you're familiar with it, Cien Años de Soledad, right? It's a novel by the Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So the novel is literature, or the genre is literature, novel to be more specific. The primary language function is expressive or artistic. So the status of the author and his characteristic style is very important. So again, we're on the faithful, perhaps, or literal side. But we'd have to look at the translation that was done by somebody like Gregory Rebasa, who translated this, and see if he indeed did a literal translation or a more natural sounding, freer, creative translation. Okay? So it's not necessarily an easy call to make. There are many factors to consider. Okay? Because I have 2 questions here. Should the text, in other words, the target text, sound like a translation? Do we want the target text to sound like a translation? To me, the King James Bible sounds like a translation. And evoke the original? Do we want a 19th century, 18th century, 17th century Bible to make us think about that original sacred text? Maybe, probably. Or should the target text sound more like a well-written, natural sounding, like it was written in the target language, right? And display target language bias and to really cater to those target language reader expectations. In the middle, as our third example, we have a museum brochure. And then we also have a sustainability report. To me, these 2 types of texts are very public, consumer, reader-oriented. One is for tourists or museum visitors. The other might be for shareholders or customers of a particular company. So these are oriented toward the public. It's very important that they not sound stilted or stiff or awkward or anachronistic. It's more important that they sound natural, that the language flows, and that it's idiomatic for the target language reader. So those ideas of cognitive equivalence, same information, but also dynamic equivalence, equivalent effect. So we're right in that sweet spot, probably, of a balanced approach, something between the extremes of literal and free. And then the 5th text, we have a magazine advertisement. Looks like maybe from the 1970s or 80s. And it has sort of a play on words, right? Start off the new year with a pink coat. So to do this, I would argue probably for the advertisement, right, the language has a strong vocative or appellative or persuasive function. If we wanted to recreate that and for it to have achieved dynamic equivalent effect, we would need to get creative with the target language. In other words, do a free, perhaps an extremely free or creative translation. So these are some texts that sort of illustrate a little bit of the decision making that goes into choosing what might be the most effective translation approach. All right, and then I'll finish with this slide. This slide shows some alignment between several of the concepts that we've been discussing in this class, starting with genre conventions, right? The genre will often tell us what the dominant or primary language function is, whether it's expressive, informative, or vocative. Based on that, going back to genre, often that will also tell us what is the most important, or what are the two, or maybe one or two, and hopefully three to a lesser extent, equivalence orientations that we want to prioritize. That information will point us toward a translation approach. So just to give an example again, if we're thinking about a sustainability report issued by a company, the dominant that's the genre, sustainability report. The domain is corporate. The dominant language function is informative, perhaps a little bit evocative. So the equivalence orientation normally would be cognitive, maybe a little bit dynamic. That's all pointing us toward a balanced translation approach, and we'll discuss in later videos, later video lessons, how this also trickles down to and affects the translation unit size that we focus on and the translation procedures that are going to be most effective.